The courtroom was filled with murmurs. The curious eyes of those present followed every movement of those involved in the trial, but none of them knew what was really about to happen. At that moment, everything seemed to be leaning against Carlos, a 24-year-old black man who was sitting at the defendant's table, his chest tight with anxiety and the pressure of a destiny that already seemed sealed. The accusation was serious: robbery. The victim, a middle-class woman who claimed to have had her purse stolen in a park, pointed directly at Carlos as the responsible party. But what no one knew, not even those who looked at him with disapproval, was that it was all a mistake that could destroy his life. Carlos looked ahead, trying to concentrate, as the judge began to read the charges. The atmosphere in the room was charged with tension, and he felt each word of the judge fall on his shoulders like a condemnation. Justice, or at least what was understood as justice in that place, had already marked him as guilty before he could even defend himself. However, something inside him refused to accept that fate. He wasn't going to give up. But how could he fight against something as big as the judicial system, a system that didn't seem willing to listen to his side of the story? What Carlos didn't know was that something unexpected was about to happen, a turn of events that would completely change the course of his story. Carlos entered the courtroom with firm steps, although his mind was full of doubts. Around him, the gazes of those present felt heavy, almost as if each of them was accusing him. He adjusted his tie, trying to keep his racing heart from betraying him. The room was full, but despite the crowd, the silence was profound. Every sound echoed in his ears: the creaking of the chairs, the rustling of papers moving, even the slight hum of the ventilation. He sat at the defendant's table next to his lawyer, Maria. She was calm, but Carlos could feel the tension emanating from her. The young lawyer's gaze was determined, as if she was ready to fight for the truth. But he knew that everything depended on what happened in those moments. The judge, with his black robe and implacable face, had already sentenced him before even hearing his side. That's what Carlos thought. The trial was about to begin, and he already felt as if he were lost. The judge, a man with a stern face and an attitude that reflected authority, struck the gavel firmly. "Let's begin with the charges," he said, his deep voice cutting through the air. Carlos felt his stomach churn as he heard those words. The judge looked at him over his glasses, as if he were already condemned. "Carlos Perez, accused of attempted robbery. Mrs. Mariana Garcia states that you snatched her purse on January 12th in the Central Park of this city. How do you plead to these charges?" he asked, showing no emotion. Carlos took a deep breath, feeling his whole body tense. He knew that what he said at that moment could change everything. "I'm not guilty, Your Honor," he replied, his voice somewhat shaky but firm. His gaze met that of the judge, who showed no sign of compassion. Carlos realized that the entire weight of the room rested on him. The lawyer Maria stood up and asked to speak, her tone respectful but full of determination. "Your Honor, I want to emphasize that there is not enough evidence to accuse my client. No fingerprints were found on the purse, and there are no witnesses linking him to the robbery. Furthermore, Mrs. Garcia's accusation is inconsistent," she argued, looking at the judge seriously. The judge looked at her without expression, but his voice left no room for doubt. "This is not a game, Counselor. If you have no further evidence, I suggest you refrain from making empty claims." Carlos felt his hope slowly fade away. The trial was taking a course he could not control. Maria tried to insist, but every time she opened her mouth, the judge interrupted her with an impatient gesture. The pressure increased in the room, and Carlos could see how the eyes of those present turned to him, evaluating every gesture, every word. Despite his lawyer's struggle, everything seemed to be against him. The room was in absolute silence when the judge gave the floor to the accuser. Mariana Garcia, the woman who had pointed Carlos out as the culprit, stood up slowly. Her face was confident, as if she was already certain that Carlos would be convicted. She looked at the audience coldly before she began to speak, accusing Carlos of having violently snatched her purse in the middle of the park. There were no tears or doubts in her voice, only a forceful accusation. Carlos felt helpless. How could he prove that he hadn't been in that park? How could he convince the judge of his innocence when his words seemed to be worth nothing? As Mariana continued to speak, a feeling of despair washed over him. He had no idea how to get out of that situation. It was at that moment that Maria, seeing the difficulty of the situation, whispered in his ear, "Remember, Carlos, don't give up. You have the right to defend yourself, and we are going to do everything possible to prove your innocence." Carlos nodded slightly, but his mind was still racing. What if the judge had already made a decision? What if the whole system was against him? The air in the courtroom was thick, as if the entire weight of the situation rested on Carlos's shoulders. As the accuser, Mariana Garcia, continued her story, Carlos felt his opportunity to defend himself fading away. Mariana spoke firmly, her voice full of confidence, as she pointed an accusing finger at him. Every word she uttered seemed like a hammer striking his innocence, hammering into everyone's mind the image of a guilty man. The judge, observing in silence, did not seem interested in Maria's objections. From time to time, a slight sneer escaped him, as if he had already decided Carlos's fate. Carlos's face hardened as he listened to each word, each unfounded accusation. He couldn't believe the situation was so unfair. He couldn't understand how the judge seemed more interested in the formalities of the process than in the truth itself. "Your Honor, my client has already expressed his innocence. There is no evidence linking him to the crime," Maria interrupted once again, in a tone that was beginning to show signs of frustration. But the judge did not let her finish. "Counselor, don't waste my time. The victim's testimony seems clear and direct. There is no need for further discussion," he replied with an impatient gesture, looking at Carlos with a coldness that chilled him to the bone. Carlos sat in silence, his mind racing. The feeling of being trapped in a game he didn't know the rules of paralyzed him. The judge seemed to have only one version of the facts, that of the accuser. How could he prove his innocence if no one gave him the opportunity to speak? Maria, although clearly upset, did not give in to the judge's attitude. At that moment, she took a sheet of paper from her folder and began to present a key witness, someone who could contradict Mariana's version. "Your Honor, I have a witness who can prove that my client was not in the park at the time of the robbery. This person has witnessed his presence elsewhere," she explained, with a renewed determination in her voice. The judge, although reluctant, allowed the witness to be called. The room filled with murmurs, and Carlos felt a small spark of hope. Maybe there was still a chance. But as the witness took the stand and began to give his statement, Carlos couldn't help but notice the judge's indifference, who seemed more interested in reviewing papers than in listening to the new evidence. Mr. Juan Perez, who works as a security guard in the building on Rio Street, has confirmed that Carlos Perez was there at the time of the alleged robbery. He has a record of his entry into the building, as well as testimony of his presence there throughout the day, the witness explained, looking at the judge seriously. But the judge, as if unwilling to accept anything that called into question the official version, barely paid attention. And how do we know that this witness is not mistaken? The fact that he was somewhere else does not mean that he did not commit the robbery. This type of evidence is not conclusive, he said with disdain, looking at the witness as if his word had no weight. Carlos felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Although he knew that the evidence was solid, the way the judge dismissed each argument left him powerless. The lawyer Maria, struggling to remain calm, tried to assert the testimonies of the witnesses, but the judge seemed to have a decision made. As the room filled with murmurs, Carlos wondered if there was really any hope that the truth would prevail. He was not used to seeing how a system, which supposedly should ensure justice, leaned so openly in favor of a single version of the facts. The situation was beginning to become unsustainable. At that instant, while Carlos thought that all was lost, Maria took a step forward, determined not to give up. "Your Honor, if you do not accept this evidence, I ask that you at least consider that there is not a single piece of evidence that proves that my client has committed the crime. And if there is no evidence, we cannot speak of guilt," she said with a firmness that Carlos had not heard before. The judge looked at her with disdain, but before he could respond, the courtroom door suddenly opened. All eyes turned to the entrance. An imposing figure stood in the doorway, Carlos's mother. The courtroom fell silent when the door swung open with force. Everyone present turned their heads, surprised by the intrusion of someone they didn't expect to see. Carlos, who was still reeling from the dismissal of his evidence, saw his mother, a woman of proud bearing and determined gaze, enter with a firm step, leaving a trail of surprise behind her. It was as if her very presence could alter the dense air of the courtroom. With her head held high and her eyes full of determination, she walked to the center of the room, bravely looking at both the judge and the accuser. Her footsteps echoed on the floor, and a sense of anticipation began to take hold of the audience. No one expected such a strong woman to enter that place, much less in the middle of such a crucial trial. The judge looked up, a mixture of surprise and annoyance on his face. "What are you doing here, madam?" he asked, clearly irritated by the interruption. "I have come to speak in defense of my son," she replied, with a calmness that contrasted with the turmoil of the moment. Her voice was clear, decisive, and every word seemed to be charged with power. The room was so still that you could hear everyone's breathing. Carlos, with his eyes fixed on his mother, felt something ignite within him. He had always known that his mother was his greatest support, but seeing her at that moment, directly confronting the figure of authority who seemed to have condemned him, gave him new strength. The judge looked at her disapprovingly. "This is not your place." "The trial has already begun. You have no right to interrupt," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but this is my son's place, and as long as he is here, so will I be," she replied with a cold smile. Her posture left no room for doubt. She would not leave without speaking. Maria, Carlos's lawyer, watched the scene in surprise. She had never seen anyone challenge the judge in that way, but she quickly realized that this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. "Your Honor, I ask that she be allowed to speak. She has every right to intervene in her son's defense," she said. And although her voice trembled slightly, her determination was clear. The judge, although annoyed, nodded reluctantly. "All right." "But only a couple of minutes," he muttered, letting the woman approach the stand. All eyes followed Carlos's mother, and in their eyes there was a mixture of respect and curiosity. With absolute calm, Carlos's mother began to speak, looking at the judge intensely. "I am Rosa Perez, Carlos's mother. I have watched my son grow up. He is not only a man of principles, but also a human being with a pure heart. Throughout his life he has faced prejudice, discrimination, and has fought against all kinds of adversities. But he has never taken the easy path or committed injustices," she said, with a voice full of love and confidence. "You, Judge, like many others, have decided that appearance is more important than truth. The simple fact that my son is accused because of the color of his skin, without a single piece of evidence against him, seems to me an injustice that I cannot allow. I am not only defending him as a mother, but as someone who firmly believes in the justice that this system should impart," Rosa continued, her gaze fixed on the judge, silently challenging him. The room was silent. Each word of Rosa's cut deep into the hearts of those who listened. Carlos watched his mother with admiration and amazement. He had always known that she was a strong woman, but seeing her stand up to the system in that way filled him with hope. The judge, who until that moment had remained distant and cold, frowned as if Rosa's words had reached him deeper than he had imagined. For a moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. However, the judge's authority still weighed heavily. "All right, Mrs. Perez," he said in a serious tone, "but I suggest you do not deviate from the subject. This court is here to hear evidence, not speeches." Rosa looked directly at him but said nothing more. Instead, she walked back to her place next to Carlos, who watched her with a mixture of gratitude and emotion. Maria, the lawyer, took advantage of the pause to speak again. "Your Honor, the truth is that the system is failing. We cannot judge a person by their appearance or by prejudice. We need evidence, and this has been presented in this court. My client is innocent, and I am not going to let him be convicted for something he has not done," she said firmly, seeking to capture the judge's attention. "Okay, here's the translation of the text into English, United States, adjusted for use in a YouTube video." The judge, however, showed no signs of changing his stance, but Carlos felt a renewed sense of hope. What his mother had done not only challenged the judge, but it gave a voice to his own defense, a cry for justice that resonated throughout the courtroom. The tension in the courtroom didn't lessen. Despite Rosa's words, the judge didn't seem willing to budge. However, something in the air had shifted. Rosa's presence had altered the dynamic, and even though the judge still displayed his disdain, the atmosphere was thick with palpable uncertainty. Now the audience seemed more attentive to every move of those involved in the trial. Carlos, his heart still racing, watched as his mother returned to his side. She gave his hand a small squeeze, a simple gesture, but full of confidence. Through her eyes, Carlos could see that she wouldn't give up, and that gave him the strength to keep going. The atmosphere had changed, even if no one could put it into words. "Now, let's continue with the case," the judge said, his voice deep and authoritative, as he looked around to make sure the room was calm again. Mariana Garcia, the prosecutor, watched with a certain smugness, as if Rosa's words and the defense's intervention were nothing more than a minor setback on her path to Carlos's conviction. But something unexpected happened. Before the judge could give the floor to continue, a figure appeared in the courtroom door, interrupting the trial's routine. A tall man in a dark jacket entered with a determined step. It was someone no one expected. He approached the stand with unusual calm, but with a look full of conviction. The man was Juan Perez, the security guard who had been mentioned as a witness by Maria. "Excuse me, Your Honor. I'm here to offer more information about the case. I've been observing the trial, and I believe I have something that could change the direction of all this," he said in a firm voice, as he directed his gaze toward the judge and then to the prosecutor, Mariana. The room went silent. No one expected another witness to appear at this point, much less someone who seemed to have additional evidence. The judge looked at him distrustfully, but nodded. "Go ahead, witness. Let's hear what you have to say," he responded, somewhat annoyed but willing to listen. Juan Perez, with a confident posture, began to speak. "As I said before, I work as a security guard in the building on Rio Street. On the day of the robbery, Carlos Perez was in that building in my presence, and I can assure you that he was there all day. The accusation that he was in the Central Park is unfounded. I saw him, and not only that, I also have the records of his entry and exit from the building that day," he explained, pointing to the papers he was carrying. Carlos felt a knot in his stomach. This testimony could be the key to his defense, but what was really surprising was the way the judge reacted. The judge's face, usually implacable, looked slightly confused. "Are you sure of what you're saying?" he asked, looking more closely at the papers that Juan had given him. "Absolutely sure," Juan replied, handing a copy of the records to the judge. Maria, who had been watching the scene with anticipation, quickly rose to take advantage of the moment. "Your Honor, these records leave no room for doubt. Carlos was somewhere else at the time the robbery occurred. This proves that not only did he not commit the robbery, but he wasn't even near the park," she said with renewed confidence. The judge quickly flipped through the papers, and for a brief moment he seemed to hesitate. Although he tried to maintain his composure, the truth was beginning to seep through his rigid posture. "This changes things, Mr. Perez," the judge said, frowning, clearly disconcerted. "But still, we need more than just a statement from a security guard. The victim's testimony is still crucial," he added, trying to maintain control of the situation. Maria was not intimidated. "Mrs. Garcia's accusation has been refuted. There is no evidence linking my client to the robbery. Furthermore, the evidence we present demonstrates that the victim's testimony is false. I ask you, Your Honor, to consider the lack of evidence and the veracity of our witnesses." Carlos looked at his mother, who was watching him with a slight smile on her lips. She knew that the battle was not over yet, but the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. The atmosphere in the room was more charged than ever, but there was a spark of hope. If all went well, his life could change radically that very afternoon. The room fell into a tense silence as the judge reviewed the papers once more. The trial had taken an unexpected turn, and no one knew how it would end. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with tension. Although the judge seemed confused by the new evidence presented, he continued to carefully observe the papers and records that Juan Perez had delivered. The accusation remained strong, but the evidence was beginning to crumble piece by piece. Carlos sat on the edge of his seat, feeling that there was finally a glimmer of justice. Carlos's mother, Rosa, was next to him, with her arms crossed, watching everything with a look that combined worry and confidence. Since she had burst into the room, she had remained alert, willing to fight whatever battle was necessary to protect her son. And now, seeing how the situation was beginning to change, she felt that the fight she had started had not been in vain. Carlos couldn't stop looking at his mother. He had always admired her strength, her ability to stand firm even in the most difficult moments. In her life, Rosa had faced many adversities, but she had always come out on top. His mother had taught him the value of justice, the importance of defending what is right, and now, by being there, she was demonstrating it in a powerful way. The judge finally put the papers down on his desk and looked at the audience, clearly disconcerted. "This witness presents interesting evidence, but there is still the victim's statement," he said in a deep voice, trying to regain control. "We cannot dismiss everything that has been said so far. We still need to consider all aspects of the case." Rosa, who had been watching the judge's behavior carefully, rose slowly. All eyes turned to her once again, surprised by her bold attitude. The judge looked at her with a stern gesture but said nothing. Rosa, confident but with a glint of defiance in her eyes, began to walk towards the stand. "Your Honor," she said in a clear and firm voice, "I have been listening to everything that has been said in this room, and I assure you that all this spectacle of accusations and evidence is meaningless if justice is not done. How can we move forward when we are not hearing the truth? My son has been unfairly accused, and you know it." The room fell into deep silence. Rosa's words resonated strongly, and people began to feel the weight of her intervention. Carlos watched his mother, admiring her courage. He knew that she had fought many battles throughout her life, but this perhaps would be the most important of all. The judge, clearly uncomfortable, frowned. "Madam, I have given you your opportunity to speak, but I remind you that this trial must be based on evidence, not emotional speeches. And while your intervention is passionate, it does not change the facts presented by the prosecutor," he responded coldly. But Rosa was not intimidated. "Facts?" she retorted with an ironic smile. "What facts, Your Honor?" The words of a woman who cannot even remember the exact time the robbery occurred. "The evidence that does not exist. My son is not guilty, and what you are doing here is using him as a scapegoat. No, Judge, this is not justice." With each word, the room seemed to fill with renewed energy. The murmurs among those present began to turn into whispers of astonishment and reflection. Even the judge himself, who seemed to have heard it all, now seemed questioned by the force with which Rosa spoke. Carlos felt a mixture of emotions as he listened to his mother, her unconditional love, the fight for his honor, for his truth. If there was anyone who could change the course of things, that person was her, and although his heart was pounding, he knew that he was not alone. His mother was there, fighting alongside him, willing to face the system for his well-being. The atmosphere in the room had been completely transformed. The judge, who had previously shown total disdain, now seemed to be evaluating each word of Rosa with more care. The audience was also attentive, some even beginning to question the validity of the accusation. "I think I have heard enough for now," the judge said after a long few seconds of silence. "The court will take a brief recess to reconsider the facts presented. We will return in 15 minutes. Carlos stayed in his place, unable to move a leg. Emotion flooded him. His mother gave him a look that was full of determination, and although he could not predict how it would all end, he knew that her fight for the truth had taken an unexpected turn. That short recess felt like an eternity, but Carlos could not help but feel that something was changing, something that might be enough to give him a chance. The 15-minute recess was an eternal moment for everyone present. Carlos couldn't stop thinking about his mother's words, how she had challenged the judge with unwavering firmness. The courtroom, which had previously been filled with cold tension, now seemed to be charged with renewed energy. Rosa had achieved something that no one had expected. She had questioned the judge's authority in a way that no one else had dared. Carlos looked at his mother, who remained standing next to him with a determined but serene look. He knew that he could not foresee what would happen next, but something inside him told him that the battle was not lost. There was a spark of hope that had not existed before. The courtroom door opened, and instantly everyone stood up as the judge returned. His face, normally impassive, showed signs of discomfort. Although he tried to maintain his composure, Rosa's intervention seemed to have touched a sensitive nerve in him. In his mind, he was probably debating between continuing with his position of authority or yielding to the pressure of the truth that was beginning to emerge. "The trial will continue," the judge announced, with a voice that tried to be authoritative, but now had a hint of doubt. "However, I want everyone in this room to focus on the facts and not on the speeches. We are here to get to the truth, not to win a war of words." Carlos, feeling the tension return to the room, listened attentively. Although the judge tried to show control, his voice trembled slightly, betraying a hesitation that he had not shown before. "Now let's continue with the review of the evidence," the judge said as he looked at the papers on his desk. "The defense has presented a witness who, although legitimate, does not change the fact that the victim's testimony remains crucial. We will not allow a single testimony, however valid it may be, to undermine the work of this court." Rosa, who was still standing next to her son, could not help but feel overwhelmed by the injustice. The judge was once again seeking to minimize the evidence that had been presented. He was not considering the key evidence that had cast doubt on Mariana Garcia's accusation. "Your Honor, doesn't the truth matter more than formalities?" Rosa asked, her voice firm as a rock. "My son has been accused of a crime he did not commit, and if the evidence is going to continue to be ignored, then this trial is doomed to failure from the beginning. Is this the kind of justice we are looking for?" The judge looked at her, clearly uncomfortable. His face hardened. "Mrs. Perez, I have given you more than enough opportunity to express yourself, but I remind you that this court is governed by the law, not by your personal opinions." The judge's response was imbued with contained fury. For a moment, it seemed that he would lose control, but he immediately regained it, straightening in his seat. "But the law cannot be blind, Your Honor," Rosa replied, showing no fear. "The law must be fair. It must be able to see beyond words and appearances. My son is being judged without evidence. What kind of law are we defending here?" The judge stared at her, his face tense. He knew that his own words were beginning to sound empty in the face of the force with which Rosa was making her defense. Silence took over the room as the judge remained still, not knowing how to respond to the truth that was being imposed on him. Carlos looked at his mother with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. She was challenging the system in a way he never would have imagined. Although he could not predict how it would all end, the figure of his mother, standing there with such determination, gave him strength. For a few seconds that seemed endless, the judge remained silent. Finally, he sighed deeply, as if he were making a crucial decision. "All right," he said, in a voice less strong but still full of authority. "We will consider the evidence that has been presented. But I must remind everyone in this room that in the end, it is the evidence that speaks, not the emotions, not the speeches. We are here to judge facts, not words." Maria, Carlos's lawyer, took advantage of the moment to intervene, with her voice calm but full of firmness. "That is what we have been looking for, Your Honor, facts. The only emotion here is the one you are imposing by ignoring the evidence in front of you." The judge looked at her with a mixture of irritation and resignation. "This court will take an additional recess to review the evidence. In 15 minutes, we will resume the trial," he announced, raising the gavel with a loud bang. Carlos and his mother sat back down. As they waited, a strange feeling washed over Carlos. There was something in the air, something that told him that even though the trial wasn't over, his mother had accomplished something fundamental. She had broken through the judge's wall of indifference, something no one else had been able to do. The 15-minute recess passed more quickly than Carlos would have liked. The murmurs in the courtroom were a constant reminder of what was at stake. Meanwhile, his mind raced. His mother had achieved the unthinkable by challenging the judge, but the trial was far from over. He knew the evidence was still in play, and the outcome of this case could change his life forever. However, there was also something else at stake now. his family's dignity, the justice they had fought so hard for, and the truth that, little by little, seemed to be coming to light. Rosa remained by his side, showing no signs of nervousness, as if every second of this trial was just one more small battle in a much larger war she had been fighting her entire life. Her face held an unwavering determination, and while Carlos could feel the pressure, he also felt they now had a real chance of winning. During the recess, Maria, Carlos's lawyer, approached them, looking at the judge with an expression that clearly showed that although the situation had improved, there was still much to be done. "What we've done today has been crucial," she said in a low voice. "At least now the judge is paying attention, but we have to keep pushing. We have to present the evidence in a way that leaves no doubt about Carlos's innocence." Carlos nodded, though he felt a great deal of uncertainty about what was to come. "Do you think we've convinced him of anything?" he asked, looking at his lawyer hopefully. "The important thing now is that he's listening, which he wasn't doing before. The defense isn't just presenting facts. We're showing the judge that this case isn't based on concrete evidence. If we can expose that Mariana's accusation is unfounded, we can win," Maria explained, adjusting the papers on the table. Carlos took a deep breath, but something inside him told him that this was the decisive moment. He knew that every word spoken from that moment on would be key to the outcome of his fate. "Now we must be more cunning. The judge is clearly annoyed, and that can work against us if we don't handle it well. The strategy will be to demonstrate that it's not just my client who is being unfairly judged, but the entire system that is defending him. We need the judge to see that this isn't just about Carlos, but about something much bigger. The fight against prejudice, discrimination, and injustice," Maria said, with a determination that surprised Carlos. At that moment, Rosa's eyes met her son's. There was something in her gaze that reassured him, even though he also felt the pressure that everything depended on what happened next. She, as always, was ready for battle. In the distance, they heard the judge's footsteps as he approached the courtroom again. The door opened and everyone stood up again, though this time Carlos felt something different in the air. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of anticipation, as if everyone in the room knew that something important was about to happen. The judge banged the gavel forcefully. "This court will resume session. Let's begin with the continuation of the evidence," he announced, looking around before fixing his gaze on the accuser, Mariana Garcia, who was sitting down, staring at the floor. Carlos noticed that she seemed more nervous than she had been at the start of the trial, which gave him a small glimmer of hope. Maria, with remarkable composure, stood up to begin her intervention. "Your Honor, before we continue, I want to remind this court that the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. The mere fact that Mrs. Garcia has stated that Carlos committed the robbery is not enough to convict him. We need concrete evidence, and that evidence does not exist," she said, looking directly at the judge, who seemed to be listening to her more attentively than before. Rosa, hearing those words, squeezed her son's hand tightly. She knew that the key moment of the battle was about to arrive. The defense had begun to gain ground, but now it was necessary to deliver the final blow. Everything would depend on how the evidence and the testimony of the witnesses were received at that precise moment. Furthermore, I want to present to the court a new statement that reinforces the evidence that my client was elsewhere at the time of the robbery. Maria continued, taking out some papers she had prepared during the recess. "This testimony is crucial. It is a sworn statement from an additional witness who saw Carlos in the Rios building during the time the alleged robbery occurred. There is no doubt that he was not in the Central Park. My client is being unfairly judged, and this must be recognized." The judge, who had been silent during Maria's intervention, finally looked at the documents she handed him. His face, previously unyielding, now showed signs of doubt. It seemed that the weight of the evidence was beginning to sink in, although he still remained reserved. "I will review it," he said finally, banging the gavel firmly. "This court will continue with the deliberation of this evidence in the next few minutes. I want everyone to prepare for the next phase. It is time for us to reach the end of this case." Carlos looked at his mother, who smiled at him slightly, without words. She had given everything for him, and now everything depended on how the judicial system received that evidence and arguments. But for the first time in the entire trial, Carlos felt that the chances of winning really existed. The courtroom filled with tense silence as the judge reviewed the evidence presented. Everyone present seemed to hold their breath, waiting for a reaction, a response that could define Carlos's fate. Carlos's mother, Rosa, remained standing next to him, watching every gesture of the judge. There was no fear on her face, only a fierce determination. She knew that the final moment was approaching and that everything she had fought to achieve was about to culminate. Carlos, for his part, was in a state of controlled nervousness. Despite the pressure, he felt a spark of hope. His lawyer, Maria, had done an impeccable job, presenting evidence and witnesses that proved his innocence. His mother, with her strength and courage, had challenged the system and had managed to get the court to pay attention. But, as she had always taught him, the final word would be justice. The judge looked up from the papers he had been reviewing and looked at the room with a serious expression. "I have reviewed the documents and the evidence presented by the defense. The testimonies of the witnesses are clear and compelling. Ms. Garcia's accusation, although she has been firm in her statement, has not been supported by any material evidence that links Carlos Perez to the robbery," he said, his tone more serious than ever. Carlos felt a slight jolt in his chest. The mention of his name in such a formal way was like a reminder of the gravity of the situation. He knew that there was still much to resolve, but for the first time in the entire trial, a small spark of hope ignited in his heart. It is evident that there are contradictions in the testimonies presented by the prosecution. The defense has demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, that my client was not at the scene of the events. The records, the statements of the witnesses, everything presented by the defense demonstrates that Carlos Perez is not guilty of the charges against him, the judge continued, his voice now firmer. Rosa took a deep breath, a sigh of relief that reflected all the weight of the accumulated tension. Although the battle was not over, what she had just heard were the words she had waited for so long, but she still couldn't relax. She knew that the judge, although he seemed to be leaning in favor of the defense, could still make an unexpected turn. Maria, standing next to Carlos, did not let her guard down. "Your Honor," she said, addressing the judge, "what is clear is that this trial has not been about the truth, but about prejudice and prior conviction. The system should not condemn someone without evidence. My client has been under suspicion for something he did not commit, and that must be corrected. Today, Your Honor, you have the opportunity to do the right thing and restore the justice that has been taken from him." The judge did not respond immediately, but his eyes reflected an uncertainty that he had not shown before. Carlos noticed how the others present in the room were also waiting for his decision. It was as if everyone had stopped in time, waiting for what the judge would say next. Finally, the judge raised the gavel. The sound it made resounding on the table was like a blow in the air, a sound full of weight, as if the entire trial had converged in that instant. He looked at the room and, with a tone he had never shown before, declared, "After an exhaustive review of the facts, the evidence, and the testimonies presented, this court has reached a conclusion. Carlos Perez, unfairly accused of robbery, is free of all charges. The trial is closed with the declaration of his innocence." Carlos couldn't believe what he had just heard. The weight he had been carrying on his shoulders for so long disappeared in an instant. A sigh of relief escaped his mouth, and he looked at his mother, who hugged him immediately, wrapping him in a strong and warm embrace. Rosa didn't need to say anything. Her look said it all. The battle was won. Justice had prevailed. The room, previously tense and silent, began to fill with murmurs, and some of those present began to applaud timidly, as if they were also relieved by the resolution of the case. Carlos, still in his mother's arms, felt a surge of gratitude and amazement. He had been on the verge of despair, but now, for the first time in a long time, he saw the light. The judge, still with the gavel in his hand, looked at the defense for a moment. "This case has been a reminder of the importance of truth and justice. May this lesson not be forgotten. The court is adjourned," he concluded, letting the gavel fall for the last time. Mariana, furious, accused Carlos of robbery again. The trial seemed to falter, but Rosa's intervention, defending her son bravely, restored order. Carlos, looking at his mother, felt renewed strength as he saw her challenge the system. The truth at last could prevail. The judge, impressed by Rosa's intervention, declared Carlos innocent. The room fell silent as the accuser was removed. Justice had finally spoken. Carlos hugged his mother, grateful. Truth, courage, and family love had saved him. The victory was his.